Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of the Mouseion, where I am joined by artist Everitte Barbee, who is an Arabic calligrapher. If you're listening to the audio version of this podcast on platforms like Apple or Spotify, you may want to check out my YouTube channel, the Professor Wingert channel, where I host a video version of the podcast, because this episode will be featuring a lot of the artists' calligraphy that you'll be able to see, and it's worth checking out. If you are listening on Apple, go ahead and remember to leave a 5-star rating and a comment. That certainly helps circulate the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and go ahead and like, comment, and share the videos. I think you're going to enjoy this one. I certainly did. Anyway, I've been I've been exposed to your work for what's probably 6 years now. And I think you've been living in Lebanon since, what was it, 2007?
Well, in 2009 is when I first went to Syria. That's when my university sent me there for study abroad. But been living in Lebanon for just over a decade now. It'll be 11 years in August.
Very
Yeah, so
cool. I was there about a decade ago. You got to see the caverns, at
Jaita?
Jaita. Yeah, exactly.
Oh wow.
Yeah, those are amazing. They've got some nice caverns, in the US, but I wasn't expecting them to be so large and so
Oh really?
cavernous, right? And I don't know
Yeah.
if have you been underneath, like in the waterway?
Oh yeah, we take the little boats down there and
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah, exactly.
that's awesome. Yeah, so I've been familiar with your work now for a while, and I used it in a lecture on religion and the development of written script, right? Because
Okay.
whether it's cult practice, whether it's maybe the tenets of certain religions, like whatever the focus is, has some kind of implication for how people communicate themselves when they're not speaking anymore, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Mhm.
textually. And then looking at Arabic text, that developed its own world at a certain point. Reaction to iconoclasm and things like this. The human impulse to create is still there, and
Mhm.
to generate art is still there, and we have these magnificent pieces. Let me just ask you. You mentioned being a student. You're studying Arabic at the time. Like, how'd you get
Mhm.
into, like, were you an artist before you were a calligrapher? Before you studied Arabic? How was that?
Well, I mean, I always loved art in school. It was always my favorite subject. But I was always of that belief. You can't make any money as an artist. You're just going to be a starving artist. So I did business at university, um, and the Arabic was almost a fluke. I mean, Edinburgh offered international business with a language, and of the languages they offered, Arabic was the one that I figured I couldn't just learn online. And So yeah, it was almost just a fluke, really. And then they sent me to Syria, and that's when it was actually just a girl I had a crush on back then that she wanted to do calligraphy lessons, and so I thought, okay, I'll try it out, and yeah, and then I stuck with it, and I got fired from my bar job in the UK, and so I started putting these pictures online that I've been making, and yeah, it's been the only job I've had since 2010.
A lot of people can't say that, right? Starving or
Yeah.
otherwise, but to have it as the only job. And I really sympathize with that story too, because when you go to university and you have the opportunity to learn language, you can either check it off the list and do Spanish or something
Yeah.
that you did in high school, right? I just picked Spanish because it's the common one for Americans. But or you can say, wow, look at all these other things I have the opportunity to take, and same with me. I ended up taking a bunch of weird languages in undergrad just because they were there, and I
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to take them otherwise, So I really relate to that. But when it comes to calligraphy, especially Arabic calligraphy. You studied with someone in Syria, is that right?
Well, my teacher in Damascus, there's a gentleman named Adnan Farid, and he's more of a, I don't want to say he teaches tourists, but I mean, he's like, compared to like these guys in Turkey, where I'd say of the top 100 calligraphers in the world, probably 80 of them teach in Turkey. Um, and one thing that, I mean, I shouldn't, I mean, he's an excellent teacher and he's, I mean, very good at what he does, but, uh, part of the real, student teacher tradition is that most calligraphers, if it's a true calligrapher teaching a genuine student, they won't take money. It's kind of, so I have teachers in Istanbul that I'll visit, and I have one teacher here who's Syrian, Fadi Uwaid, uh, and I know like he'll take money from certain people, and I've tried to pay him a bunch of times for lessons, but um, part of the deep tradition of calligraphy is that every calligrapher is taught his trade. Um, every calligrapher is expected to teach a certain number of hours a week for free because he learned his craft for free. Um, and so sometimes you'll have calligraphers that'll go and, an apprentice might, clean their master's house while they're taking lessons or that kind of thing. Um, but yeah, I mean, I say that he teaches to tourists in the sense that he'll take money for the teaching, which as a tourist I was very happy to have. Um, but then these guys from Irsika and Istanbul, when I was telling them, okay, my teacher Adnan, they say, oh, he was taking money. That's not a real, they kind of look down on that. But yeah, I mean, these guys in Istanbul, at Irsika, like one of my teachers there, a friend of mine, they all have these what they call an ijaza, and I haven't even earned my ijaza yet. I mean, I'm still maybe a year or two away from that. But they have these, and it's basically like a permit. So it's once you reach a certain level, or once you've produced a perfect mashik or workbook, you're permitted to teach. And on your ijaza, it'll have the isnad, or the chain of the silsila, like of all the teachers. So it'll say, Zaki was taught by, Hassan Jalabi, who was taught by Muhammad Aitach, who was taught by, and these names will go back in a continuous unbroken chain all the way back to Ibn Mukhla, who lived in like 9th century Baghdad, like Abbasid Baghdad. So I mean, it's this huge continuous unbroken chain, but at the same time it's also evolving. So Irsika is kind of the governing body of calligraphy these days, based in Istanbul, because they still have all the old libraries and collections, from the old Ottoman Empire, and they'll hold these competitions every year, and so they'll have a competition in every particular script, or at least the classic scripts, and you'll notice like there's an evolution. I mean, the evolution is still continuing. So, and you'll even have a debate amongst calligraphers. They'll say, okay, Hassan Jalabi thinks the wow should finish slightly higher than what Muhammad Aitach's school teaches, and eventually one of these versions will die out. I mean, whatever becomes the accepted, and so I mean all these calligraphers will produce the same text for these competitions. So you'll have maybe 200 calligraphers, just in Jeli Diwani, they'll all be producing the same exact words, and they have choice in how you arrange it, as long as you follow these rules. But what's fascinating to me is that it's extremely codified, and they're very scientific about the way they view calligraphy. It's more of a science than an art in a way, but it's still evolving. So I mean, even just if you look at the winner's plates from 2011 versus the winner's plates from 2020, I mean, you'll see a really genuine evolution of the script. I mean, they'll get more and more perfect every year. And I'm actually, I mean, I've been doing this 10 years, and I'm not, I was at this calligraphy festival in Algeria, which involves one of these competitions. It wasn't sponsored by Irsica. And, but all the pieces are hung up and everyone's saying, which is the best piece and who's going to win kind of thing. And about half the calligraphers that I was talking to about this, they all pointed to this one guy's piece. And they said, no, this is definitely the winner. And they all knew before it was called that, like, oh, he's clearly superior to the others. And I still couldn't figure out why. I'm looking at it, I'm like, what is the... and again, that was Thuluth, which is not a script I'm proficient in. I mean, all my work is in Jeli Diwani or Rukka Diwani, which is like very juvenile for the traditional scripts. It's only like 500 years old, whereas the Nasakh and Thuluth, they go back, at least 1,500 or at least 1,000 years that they've been in this shape roughly. But yeah, there's just so much details, particularly in Thuluth and Nasakh. I mean, it has to be exact. They've identified these perfect proportions, and a lot of it's based on the same aesthetics that the Greeks identified. You can pretty much find phi, or the golden ratio, in almost every curve of every letter. And I've seen these calligraphers that, they have these compasses, with a three-legged compass that automatically moves to phi, and you can pretty much put that anywhere on a piece, and the other leg is going to land right at the edge of one letter or another, if it's a good calligrapher at least.
I know proportionality is a big deal in Arabic calligraphy. Like, it's sort of, if I understood, one of the key components, I think, to it. Do you think, or is there a different set of rules for different scripts?
Oh yeah, definitely. And so it's all based on this, like, nizam al-niqat, or like the system of points. And so so each pen has a flat edge, obviously, for traditional calligraphy. And so the first letter you'll typically write will be the aleph. And so this will have a set height in most of the scripts. So in Thuluth, the aleph will be, I think it's, don't quote me on this, but I think it's 7 nuqat high, and roughly 1 nuqat and a half wide. But actually, it's not a perfectly vertical aleph either. It tilts slightly to the side. So all of this is exactly identified. And it's called Thuluth because most letters are a third of the height of the aleph. Whereas in Diwani, the script I use, lends itself much better for these visual images because it has a bit more flexibility and there's these kind of flowery embellishments that are added to it. And the Ottomans actually used this as a form of encryption or to authenticate documents, so that the scribes would actually include all these, not really exceptions to the rule, but if you have 3 ways of writing the ba, or the 3 sizes of the ba, the second ba would always be a certain size in this text. So a scribe in any particular province that knew these exact, not just the overall visual rules, but knew the internal rules, they could verify, okay, this was a fake letter that somebody wrote, but it's not actually from the Sultan. And so that, for me, that was very fascinating. And they've kind of overcomplicated it in a way, or over-embellished it. And the script I use is not typically used for writing Quran, although they do use it to write Quran, but it's not as perfectly legible. Because it has so many embellishments. If you're reading Nasakh or Thuluth, you can read it very easily straight through. There's no ambiguity. Whereas Diwani, it means Diwan, from the Ottoman court. So a lot of it was like land grants, and like a buddy of mine, he's like, his house here in Lebanon, they have this 250-year-old house where their deed is actually, the whole deed is written in Diwani, and at the top they have their traditional sword shape with the Jeli Diwani, and then underneath it everything else is written in Rukka Diwani. But that was it was a legal document. And then Yeah, so it's more of a bureaucratic script than a religious script. Although, I mean, they're all used in a religious context as well.
I I think when a lot of people, um, well, I shouldn't even say a lot of people, when looking at Arabic calligraphy, sometimes the text is obvious, and
Yeah.
other times I'm like, what am I reading here? And
Yeah.
is it meant to always be, uh, should we always be able to read it? Right. Or does the
Well,
art supersede the, like the textual content?
So, I mean, for me, I'm very strict in that, I want to make sure it's a authentic text that's there and that I don't make any grammar mistakes. And there's a way, like sometimes I'll hold up a piece of paper next to the piece, and you can kind of, or like any vertical shape, and if you move that along the line, the first like edge of the letter that hits that shape, you can follow that strict order and you can sound it out. But yeah, even sometimes people ask me, what does this piece say? And I'll tell them the English translation, but then they're like, can you read it? And it'll take me a minute because, I'm typically when I'll write in Fusha, and I'll write, I'll use somebody else's translation. And my Arabic's not fluent by any means. So, I'll get lost trying to read my own pieces sometimes. Yeah. I know what's written there, but, it's like, which way did they say, which verb for take did they use? Or, there's, you have a huge vocabulary, there's options. So I'm trying to and it's hard to tell, especially if it's a visual image. If I'm drawing the shape of a horse or something, I can't follow those rules because, you can't just go along a straight line with a ruler because you don't know, okay, how do you actually follow it? So, yeah, I was presenting a piece to, for the U.S. consul in Dubai to the royal family, and the guys, the U.S. consul's like, here, read it out to him. What does it say? And I get halfway through it, and I'm like, yeah, I can't actually remember what was written. It's all there, but yeah. And whereas my buddy Fayez that used to work with me, he was raised Muslim, so he's half the Quran he's memorized, and so a lot of times when somebody says, can you read this, and he'll kind of know where he is basically, but he's reciting more from memory than actual, than actually seeing each word, and he'll kind of, and I think it's like that for a lot of, even a lot of traditional calligraphers or native speakers, they'll kind of puzzle over it for a few minutes until they recognize a few words, and then the full meaning will come. But it's also, typically that's because it's a text that's, it's a prayer that's repeated often, or it's a verse that everyone knows. And so in some way, it's like the more complicated you make it, you can show off your knowledge of your theological knowledge, because you can, you recognize this text out of this image.
Interesting.
Whereas for mine, what I'll typically do is, especially if it's a complex visual image, I'll always try to have the text written in simple Diwani underneath it. So at least that's, it's very legible if you want it to be. But then, but I always make sure that the text is there. And there's no words repeated and there's no words left out, unless the whole text is repeated. So sometimes it'll be a phrase that I'll repeat 20 times to fill a shape. But if it's a paragraph, it's really important to me that it's still calligraphy. I don't want to just be, there are a lot of calligraphers that'll just kind of draw shapes and then ascribe a meaning, or they'll have a few words and then fill it in with shapes that don't have meaning. But for me, I don't know if it's the OCD or just I've set these rules for myself, kind of. I don't want to go too far from the tradition. Obviously with the visual images, I'm breaking out of that to some extent, but maybe it's arbitrary how I break these rules, but I try not to. At the end of the day, the meaning of the text is the most important. So
yeah, it's text.
Grammatically go outside that.
Right. You could participate in a different, form if you just want to do a design or an image or something. But this is calligraphy. It's the graphy. It's the text that's central, to the process. I think the legibilities, and it's tough when we don't have this tradition in European languages. We have manuscripts that are calligraphic. We have things like the Book of Kells. We have like our own
illuminated manuscripts.
Yeah, exactly, illuminated manuscripts, and we have beautiful calligraphic writing. There's a tradition of calligraphy, but it's not the same where you have, a lineage, going back to the Abbasid period, where that's the major art form. And geometric design, I think, are the two, the legacy of art in the Islamic world, right? Where you've got these, the impulse to create in an aniconic environment. We have text, East Asian text like Chinese and Japanese, Shiji in Japanese, Japanese calligraphy. It's its own, or I mean, same as Chinese for that matter, but it has its own sort of set of principles and rules. But what we see with Arabic is it's become its own thing. And I think that one reason why we don't have, we don't have the English language, let's say, posed and formed in the way that you might design it with Arabic letters, or the way that any Arabic calligrapher might. To that point, you're a little different, I think, than a lot of the other Arabic calligraphers I've seen, who maybe, the movement, if I can call it that, the harakat of the text itself becomes its own piece of art. Whereas, you might form words that could be interpreted as an elephant, as the Beatles, as John Travolta, right? Like as a number of things. In your case, like, are there a number of artists who take that approach? And I've seen other like forms of animals and things, but generally living forms aren't celebrated, or I mean historically, right? Like in that part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I've asked a couple, especially at some of these calligraphy conventions. I mean, you meet a lot of very conservative, sheikhs, or and so I've asked a few of them, is this, am I doing something offensive, or is this going across the line? And they talk about a lot of these regulations they have on iconoclasm is, they don't want to end up with, a pasty white Jesus, or, because anyone kind of draws the, if you're going to draw an image of Jesus, you're going to draw him like a person, and so, I mean, for them, it was like, I did one Quranic surah with this Surah Al-Fil, the elephant, and it's in the shape of an elephant. And so I was asking him about this piece. I was like, this is an animal. Is it offensive? Or is this okay? Or, should have I done a geometric shape? And he would say, well, it's not, you're not trying to say this is a particular kind of elephant. Or you're not saying, he's like, from this image, you can't see if it's an Asian elephant or an African elephant. You've just taken the meaning, the Quran says the elephant, and it doesn't, and obviously no one thinks that there was some calligraphy elephant walking around, so for them it's the image, as long as it's abstracted to the point of not beyond the, so you're not creating a new meaning, you're not adding a meaning that wasn't there in the original Quran, for instance. Whereas I was recently asked to make this portrait of Sheikh Ahmad Ubamba, who was a sheikh of the Muride Brotherhood in West Africa, but his photo was actually taken, and there's one photo that exists of this sheikh, and I was asked by this Muslim artist group to produce this image for them, and again, I think it's a similar issue of, it's an actual photograph of this man, and it's done with his poetry. So it's not, I'm not imagining I'm not imagining him as some Caucasian guy or some, I'm trying to keep that image exactly as that photograph was, or as close to that photograph as I can. So I think a lot of this iconoclasm just comes from trying to avoid, creating sects, other, like in Christianity, how we draw the different saints. Actually, we have the Orthodox, which draw their icons in a certain way, and the Catholics will kind of draw it any way they want, and then, which over time, part of that was political differences, which became religious. But I think also these cultural differences do over time become, a religious difference. And you see that a little bit between Sunni and Shia, and the Shia are a bit more, they like to embellish a bit more, and they're less strict with their iconoclasm than, especially, now that you look at the ISIS flag, they won't even use traditional calligraphy because that's considered an embellishment, whereas, so they just, that's why you have that, it looks like a 2-year-old drew the Shahada on a black flag, it's, but it's because they're rejecting even thuluth is a form of, which is, one of the most beautiful and perfect calligraphy scripts in my opinion, but for them that's, I forget the word for it, but it's like an indulgence, they're kind of, it goes beyond what was given to you in the Quran. The Quran didn't specify, rules of calligraphy, so like you're interpreting God's will too deeply, or, I don't, but yeah, it's just an embellishment that they disagree with. So there's many levels of iconoclasm, I guess.
Yeah, right. I think levels is the issue. And one thing that I've loved about calligraphy and the, Arabic calligraphy's response to iconoclasm is that, in a way it's like tasography, right? Or, when you turn the cup upside down and you read, something. Look, it's coffee grounds upside down. That's what it is. Like, that's it. When you see a cloud in the sky, it's like it's moisture in the atmosphere, full stop, right? Okay, but it is a dragon. Yeah, okay, I see what you mean. It is a dragon. It is an elephant. Yeah, I see what you mean. But it's just a cloud, right? Like in the end, it's a cloud. In the end, calligraphy is text. It's artistic usage of text, and it's your fault if you see an elephant in that, like that's not an elephant. Elephants don't have those, spaces in between where the trunk, might meet the forehead and things like that. And it just as a, what would you call it? A loophole, right? That I guess.
Yeah, these are just words.
Yeah. Pun intended with the loophole. But, your stuff is, I would say it's clearly you're inspired by something. And I wonder, like, well, what motivate, like some things are obvious, right? You've done shapes of countries. I've seen Jordan, Syria, et cetera. And those are really cool. So the Tennessee flag, right? That's something we probably might not see, with Arabic calligraphy. You had that based on a song, is that right?
Yeah, it's just the Tennessee state poem, actually. So it's "Oh Tennessee, My Tennessee." It's which, and I never really, it wasn't a poem I was familiar with, but I was trying to find, so I did this flag series, with the American flag with the Pledge of Allegiance, and then the Lebanese flag with their national anthem, and so, I was trying to find something that wasn't going to get political. If I pick Dolly Parton, then the Johnny Cash people are going to get upset. And if I, it's like, but okay, this is our official state poem, so we'll just put that. Because I just want it to be kind of just generic Tennessee. I didn't, and most of them, why most of these maps are just the towns and cities on the map. There's not a, not that I'm a afraid of being political, but yeah, those pieces, that wasn't really the point. It was just to, and also just that a lot of these borders, especially in the Middle East, were just arbitrarily drawn by, in the post-colonial era. So I mean, it was literally
Episode 3 of the Mouseion, if you haven't listened yet.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I think I might have, actually. I'm trying to think which one that was. I listened to a bunch of them because I'm sitting here at the light box all day, so I just had them on in the background, just try to get a feel for things, see what was going to be like.
Yeah, definitely. Well, what I wonder with you, do you start with like the image in mind or the text in mind, or does it depend on the project?
Yeah, it really depends on the project. Like sometimes I'll have an image that I really want to do, that's stuck in my head, and so I'll find a text that fits that. And I guess the Tennessee flag was kind of a case in point. It's like I needed, okay, what am I going to put in this flag? Whereas, and I'd say probably about half of my work has actually been commissioned. So I mean, because it takes me a very long time to make a piece. So, but I'll take a commission, and then I'll sell prints of that afterwards to kind of make back some of the time spent on the commission. So I'm not having to, bill somebody hourly for an original piece. And so, yeah, part of that is, people will just come to me with a text and an image. And the interesting part of it is, they'll give me a content of the image, but they won't actually give me a specific image. So it's trying to find an image that can still carry the words without getting too complicated, that'll still clearly present that idea to someone that's looking at it. And it's funny you mentioned clouds and how what people see from it, but I've been thinking a lot about what do you like, oracles, or I mean, like you said, the tea leaves, or and it's kind of the same concept of that. And why, like, the Romans and the Greeks, they place so much emphasis on, what these royal chickens did, and how they pecked at the food. And I think a lot of it was just filtering out options. I mean, it was like, okay, well, the chickens did this today, so that narrows our selection of choices down to these 3 choices. And so I don't think it was so much about, they don't think the chickens actually knew something, but it was like, okay, at least we can whittle down our options. And even like our wedding, as part of the protocols, my fiance's family, they consult their astrologers, and they gave us a selection of dates. They say, okay, it's going to be one of these 5 dates. Which one works? Which, it kind of takes a lot of the pressure off. You just, okay, we'll pick one of these. And I feel like commissions, I've definitely pushed the boundaries of my art in a similar way. It's like, okay, they gave me this. I got a certain amount of text and a certain idea that needs to be conveyed. So how do I find the image that works for that? So, it's filtering out all the noise, basically. But yeah, I mean, in terms of how I pick an image, if it's not a commission, yeah, most of it's part of a series. So I've been working on a big series of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is like, so that's 30 articles. So each piece is, I'm doing a piece for each article that tries to convey somewhere that maybe where we've gone wrong or where we can improve, or and then the map series and this flag series. So I've done a series of American flags, and then and jihadist flags, actually, but with American propaganda on it. And so it's kind of, is it still an ISIS flag if it says "God bless America" on it, or is it still a Saudi flag if it says "Make America Great Again"? Or so
Maybe.
Yeah, yeah, and
That's cool. I love that tension, and that, like, that's something that I would expect from an artist. You know what I mean? And
yeah.
Bringing up a specific conversation, right? Like, and ideally, when maybe not ideally, but often, and that's probably better to say, often art, wants to evoke that. It wants to evoke, maybe it doesn't want to tell you everything, but maybe it wants you to start talking.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I mean, like dilemma I face a lot is, if an artist really knows what he wants to say with a piece, then it almost becomes propaganda. And so, when I actually have a text that's, shouting out to you out of the piece, it's like, am I making, where do I draw the line between propaganda and art? And, but I think I do end up making a lot of propaganda. I mean, if the U.S. consul commissions a piece for the Emirati royal family while they're bombing a bunch of Yemenis and the text is about tolerance, then, that's probably propaganda. Yeah.
that checkbox, right? It checks all the boxes. Yeah, no, I mean, it's certainly interesting like that. I know, as an amateur calligrapher, what I've done in the few pieces I put together, gosh, it's been a long time. I mean, similar boat, right? Like you gotta eat. So I haven't done it in a while. But one thing was a Christmas tree. Another thing was a cross, and then the question for me is, well, what speaks to that yields like or makes it possible for me to yield such an image? What sort of words do I speak into writing that yields or leads to an image like that? And anyway, I've started with the image first, and I think that's probably that's the case for some of them. The other ones where I start with the text first, now that I think of it, I don't know that I can call it an image. If that makes sense. Like I don't think it fit into anything. I think it became its own sort of thing. People would call it tribal, but I think that's that just means
abstract,
they don't know. Yeah, they don't know how to speak about Polynesian tattoos, so they call them tribal, and then that becomes its own genre after a certain point in time. And anything that has a sharp edge, that you don't know what is it. Is it a thorn? Are those barbs? What are those? And
it's like that. It's that Always Sunny in Philadelphia episode when he gets a tattoo and he's like, yeah, it's tribal, and he's like, oh yeah. What tribe are you from?
yeah, exactly.
It's just shapes on your arm. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I can relate to that a little bit. I know some of your art is maybe, I think it's real normal for the Western world, but might be scandalous for different parts of the world. Like if you show a figure of a person, a woman, let's say, how's that received, in a place like, I mean, Lebanon's cool. I would, or at least my experience with Lebanon, it's no one cares, but maybe different borders or different neighborhoods, even, it's taken differently. How's that been for you?
I've always been surprised at how, we have this idea of the Middle East as this very conservative place, and definitely when I was in Saudi, I was kind of afraid which pieces I could show there. But I mean, for the most part, yeah. I mean, there's a couple of photographs I did where I drew some Jahiliyyah texts on some naked women and calligraphy, and then there's some other pieces where I did like a couple of Mark Twain quotes in calligraphy on a girl's face, and something about like calligraphy being on skin. I had a lot of people get mad and they say, "How dare you write the words of our Lord on human skin?" And I was like, well, I mean, I like Mark Twain, but I didn't think he was your Lord. But
the white beard is what, well, I think he was only white mustache now that I think about it, right? Yeah. He's white mustache.
But yeah, I mean, so it's usually they'll think I've done something, they thought that was the Quran, so they got offended. But, typically, I mean, I'm not out to offend people. And so, but yeah, generally it's not been, yeah, I mean, I think in general the Middle East is far more tolerant than we really like to believe.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that's not necessarily true about Saudi Arabia, but I mean, outside of that, I mean, yeah, I mean, Syria, you can say what you want as long as you're not talking about the regime. I mean, in Lebanon, you can really say what you want about anybody. And yeah, I mean, I guess I mean, it's kind of the same. You know, Egypt, you wouldn't complain about, you know, the government there, or Jordan, you wouldn't talk about the monarchy. But you know, there's a few red lines, but um, I mean, people in general are pretty tolerant, and you know, if they are the people that are going to be upset by a certain image, they're probably not the people that are going to go to an art exhibition anyway.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, I had kind of an interesting. So for that same, you know, when the U.S. consul commissioned this piece for the uh, Dubai royal family, they, you know, I did a small exhibition in the ambassador's house, and so I sent him a bunch of these. He said, you know, what pieces do you want to show? We'll show whatever you want. And so I sent him, you know, I sent him a few pieces that I knew they'd like the American flag and stuff, and then I sent him a bunch of human rights. This piece is based on this UDHR. And so one of them was a portrait of Raif Badawi, this gentleman who ran a blog in Saudi and then was locked up. I mean, way before MBS came on the scene, this guy was locked up, and I mean, I think his punishment is like 80 lashes or something, but like a lashing is actually like a visceral beating, and this is over a period of like 20, something like, I mean, he's been in there at least 10 years now, I think. So I showed this image, and then I had like a rainbow flag that says everyone's equal before the law, and a few of these other pieces based on the UDHR, which the U.S. consul said, no, we don't really want those pieces. You can, you know, we'll take the American flag and the Statue of Liberty and this kind of stuff, but you know, we don't want the human rights pieces, that, you know, or the rainbow flag. Which, I mean, I was kind of really miffed about the rainbow flag, just because that's, I mean, I've got probably 200 different bottles of ink in that painting. I mean, it's one of the most vivid pieces I've done and most detailed. And then 2 years later, I did this exhibition in Beirut that was sponsored by Khawla bin Suwaidi, this Emirati princess. And so she said, you know, which 6 pieces do you want to show? And I put that piece in, and she didn't bat an eye. I mean, she, you know, so on the one hand, the U.S. consul doesn't have the balls to show it, but you know, in Dubai, but then yet this Emirati princess, she's got the balls to show it in Beirut. And then actually she got in trouble for it from their own, like the charge d'affaires, and like, they don't even have an ambassador here, but there's like the charge d'affaires of the embassy of the Emirates in Beirut, like, insisted that that piece be pulled from the exhibition, and then it was, and so she called to apologize. She's like, I really love this piece, but they're making a fuss, so like, we'll set it aside. And then one of her assistants, or one of the girls, was like kind of a fixer for the exhibition. She's like, yeah, we just have to hide it while the ambassador's here on the first night, but then we can bring it back out once he's so I mean, it was like I mean, there's all this drama over, I mean, it's not, you know, 2 guys shagging on a Quran. It's just a rainbow that says everyone's equal before the law.
Look, Noah is common to every tradition over there, and the rainbow first, you know, like it's a Noah tradition, right? And you can always just couch it under that and say, okay, well, this is like, you know, this is the common prophetic heritage. We'll put it over here and you know, see if they buy it or not, right?
Yeah. Well, it just, I mean, it really ticked me off that this is such a part of our foreign policy, you know, that, you know, we're promoting this all around the world, but then I was like, well, why wouldn't you can't even show it in the consul's residence, you know, like, are we that, like, afraid? Or but I mean, it's kind of like, you know, we assume the worst about the others, so it's
yeah, Middle Eastern people are very normal. I mean, you know, with several exceptions, but I think when you couch things in exceptions, you're like, okay, well, then being an exception, like, welcome to the United States, welcome to, like, I've met, you know, nutty people in Canada, and Canada I think of as kind of the most normal humans, right? Like,
very polite and very,
they're polite, they, you know, and you get in with the right crowd, you'll enjoy hockey and Molson, and it's all good, you know. Like, that's the extent of it. Heavy metal music, right? I mean, I don't know, that was high school and college, but Yeah,
I
no.
think all the cold countries, it's big heavy metal for some reason. I don't know, something about being locked inside or.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you got some good Scottish metal while you were there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Tell me about, the Arabic pieces that are what, like, if I look at them, they look patriotic to me. They look patriotic American, right? The Eisenhower's elephant, for example. What's the text behind that, and like, it's obviously Arabic, not English, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that one's just a quote by Eisenhower, and he's saying, if there was a political party that wanted to was talking about getting rid of Social Security and the social safety net and these welfare programs, then that party would cease to exist. And it's like, okay, there's a Republican president saying that, and then yet we look at our current situation, and that's kind of exactly what is happening now. So he made this sort of prophecy, but it didn't come to play at all. So, I mean, I just thought that was a really interesting quote by Eisenhower that, who I thought was one of our better presidents. So, yeah, I mean, and I still want to do the Cross of Iron speech or quote at some point, but just haven't gotten around to it. But I think those are two of his more interesting quotes.
And that's in Arab, like that's in Fusha, which is, like the standard Arabic for those who don't know, listening. It's not in a local.
Yeah, so that one's in Fusha. Yeah, and typically if it's, I mean, if it's something that could be translated into Fusha, I'll always do that. Whereas, like, I did a Janis Joplin piece a couple years back of, "Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz? My friends all drive Porsches. I must make amends." And it's the Stallion of Stuttgart, where both Porsche and Mercedes are made. But in that one, I put, I translated it in Fusha, but it's not really a text that. I mean, you can't really say that phrase in Fusha, like, "Won't you buy me? I must make amends." These are not. I mean, So in that one, it's translated both in Amiya Lebanese and once in Fusha. The text is written maybe 4 times in the horse, but the Fusha's drawn in what they call Jelly Diwani, and then underneath that the Amiya is in Ruqa Diwani. So just to differentiate between the styles of writing, but yeah, that's the other thing with Arabic is, like, I mean, you realize how impossible it is to really translate the full meaning of something. I mean, like, I'll usually go to 2 or 3 different translators for every piece just to make sure, and they'll never translate something the same way. And so then I'll send them back the other one's translation. It's like, well, what connotation does this give it? And I mean, it's amazing to me that we put so much emphasis on the King James Bible, but then that's translated from Latin, from Greek, from Aramaic. So it's like I wonder what meanings were, I mean, there's so many things that are literally lost in translation. I mean, I guess that's why that's a phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, or totally, like, reimagines, right? Like our name James, in
Yeah.
English is ultimately Aramaic and Hebrew Yaakov.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a phonological process that gives us James, and it makes sense. Like if you follow the chain of custody, across languages and time. But in the
I used to work in
meantime,
this.
I used to work in a used bookstore, and they also had some of these rare old books, and they had it looked like a witch's spell book. I mean, it had these like metal clasps on it. It was, this big leather-bound book, but it was a breeches Bible, and so they call it a breeches Bible because, like, when God first, when Adam and Eve first feel ashamed in the garden, they go and it says something, they prepared clothes for themselves, but like in this translation, it was, they went and put on breeches or breeches. So their translation was just, okay, that's how clothing these days is breeches. So they put on some breeches, which is, yeah, I mean, I guess there's many ways you could read that.
yeah, right, yeah. It and how it moves, with its nuance, over time, like now we might laugh at a word like
Yeah.
the britches.
But going back to this propaganda discussion, I mean, it's always fascinating to me that, we'll translate the same phrase from Latin or from, into these words in Latin that have become like common parlance, like literature and propaganda. But the same words in Greek, which literally have the same meaning, is scripture and evangelize. And so it's, propaganda is just spread the good news, and to evangelize is to spread the good news. And it's literally, if you translate it from using the Greek word, it has a very positive connotation. To evangelize is to spread the gospel, and scriptures is just writings, but it's holy writings. Whereas literature is also writings, but it's not sacred, and whereas propaganda has a very negative connotation now, but it also means spread the good news. So as a spiritual linguist, I wonder if that's something that's very amusing to me, that we could have these literally verbatim translations from the same meaning, but it's a very opposite context almost, or not necessarily opposite, but
Yeah, what do we do with words like haram and qadish, or Quddus, in Arabic?
Yeah.
Like they both mean to keep something separate,
Yeah.
and keep something separate. What? Like, well, don't touch it. Don't touch it.
Yeah.
Why? Because it's bad, because it'll hurt you. Yet, of course, in Jerusalem, the sanctuary is a Haram Sharif, right?
Yeah.
And so you get some of that older, it's separated because it's a sanctuary, it's a holy site. In the same way that holiness in Qadish or Quddus, Aramaic versus Arabic, keeping something separate, keeping it away.
Yeah.
Well, why?
I didn't know that.
For something good, for for a good purpose.
To make it special, yeah.
Yeah, to make it special. And our Polynesian word tapu, where we say taboo, is the same word. It's the same connotation as holiness. Like, you don't touch it because it's tapu. It's not for you to touch.
Yeah.
Right. So, it's taboo, I'm not going to touch it. Right. And now we're like, that's things you don't do. Those are taboo. Well, no, like it's sacred. And
things you touch at your own peril is
right. You're in the profane world, and there's something profane about, like mixing sacred and profane that you don't do. And so we have these words that have these dual meanings. We should, like, that's its own podcast, right? Like, there's enough worth exploring just in how we yield to nuance over time, and like what seems to be what seems to connect with the society more, right? Like, what's used in what context, and why is that the case? But yeah, I dig that myself. Just looking at your stuff, I really love the animals that you've done. I mean, you've got the tiger, you've got this bird flying. What was it called? Fairuz's
Fairuz's werewar, which is in English, I think we'd call it a bee eater, or a meropidae is like the Latin name. So it's a song like "Dakhlak ya tayra werewar," like fly away, young bee eater bird, and like fly to my relatives, ask them how they are, and give them news of me, basically. So it's this, I mean, it's a famous Fairuz song that I just picked the one. And again, like this piece, I mean, I knew I needed to do something from Fairuz, and it was just looking for ideas, and really just reading through lyrics and seeing what stuck. And yeah, because even if I'm listening to Fairuz, like in the souk or out and about, you hear it a lot. But I'm not really listening to the meaning. I'm just listening to the sound more than anything. So it's not like if I listen to an English song, I mean, there's a certain, the meaning is what, or the words are what gives it meaning, I should say. Whereas most of the Arabic music I like, it's more about the sound or the
melody,
almost the nostalgia.
Yeah, a buddy of mine has a similar issue, and unfortunately, he was called on to DJ a church function, and like he didn't listen to any lyrics and he just put on Sexual Healing, and that went over real well.
Yeah.
But he's just there whistling along to it, not really thinking about.
Yeah. The context. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's cool, man. Do you have a favorite piece? I mean, I think your Welsh flag is, fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
It's not colored though. Do you choose, like, is it an ink issue? And with prints, can you, like, in digitally color things? Have you ever thought about this stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, so you're right. Yeah, it's black and white, and the first color piece I ever did was the Lebanese flag, actually. And I've worked in color, but I wouldn't make prints of it. Whereas and that's largely why. So I mean, I might make a color original, but all the prints that I sold are in black and white. Because early on, especially when I lived in Scotland, I didn't have access to really good printers or good Jickley printers that I could afford, at least. So I could only afford to print in black and white. Whereas now Lebanon's got excellent printers. So I mean, and part of it's also the editing. I mean, just because you scan an image, it's not necessarily going to look exactly the same. Whereas if it's only black, you can really keep all the meaning there. But yeah, it was only until I found somebody that I really trusted that could edit the colors to make them print the same way that they look when you see the original. And so now, yeah, I'm not quite as I will do work in color, but it's still, yeah, I mean, black is still my favorite to work with. Just, I mean, because it prints reliably. There's not going to be nuance in the color. It's yeah, it's still my favorite. And even my printer, the guy that does my editing, so I mean, he gets money off editing the colors, but he's like, I don't know why you do this in color. Like, your black stuff is way better. And which, yeah, it's still it's more authentic in a way. Calligraphy was, the true calligrapher's ink was actually collected from the lamps in the mosque. So they'd take all the soot from the top of the lamp. This, even in calligraphy circles, they call it lamp black or bone black, because it's the ash from burning fats or bone, or just lamp oil in the case of the mosque. So they'd collect all this soot and then mix it with gum arabic, and then the liquor and everything, the silk, and that's, so I mean, the black ink is kind of the most sacred in a way. I mean, I'm obviously not collecting it from the lamps in the mosque, but that black ink still carries that connotation in a way. And it's the most dense pigment, because with Islamic calligraphy, when you're using the wooden pen, you really can't put that much ink on the paper. It's not a very wet pen. I mean, it's quite a dry nib. So black ink will still look very, very black, even if it's the thinnest layer of ink. Whereas once you start using colors, you really gotta. I mean, you can make them dense, but a lot of times you'll have to go back and kind of pool the color on a flat surface. So if I'm working on wood, I'll do everything with the calligraphy pen, but then I'll go back and actually apply like a very watery layer of paint that's like, wherever it's wet, the paint will actually spread itself. So I'll keep the surface totally flat. I don't work on anything vertical, just so that just to get enough pigment to stay on the canvas or on the board, to get the vivid color out. Yeah.
Well, how do we commission your work, or how do we get a hold of your prints? What's the way to connect?
I have a website. It's just everitte.org, Everitte, and .com too. Actually, I guess I have them both now. And so yeah, I sell any prints that I still have in stock. I sell on my website, and I do take some commissions, but there's a bit of a waiting list for that. But yeah, I mean, write me. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Oh, very cool, man. Well, I'm a fan of your work, and I hope a lot of people get a chance to see your work too. If you're listening to the audio podcast, go ahead and check it out on YouTube, because we're going to have the images. You'll get to see what we're talking about as we're doing it. So I want to thank you for joining me today. There's a lot I learned and a lot to talk about still, and I think this is one of those, science and arts forms, the calligraphy that, maybe maybe it happens in other languages, maybe traditions develop, in ways they just haven't. But I think, when words can start dancing on a page, and, I think you once said words start singing, right? Like, through the visual. That's really, where calligraphy kind of separates itself from other art forms. So thank you again. And, we'll keep in touch, because I want to see the stuff that you're producing.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been, I really enjoyed talking to you. Hope we can do it again.
We shall. And that's it.